Hello! This year I was blessed with a very long commute and I decided to listen to as many books as possible. Thanks to that, I was able to listen to some very long books that otherwise I would have dropped. And I also tried to concentrate only on fiction because this year has been a little bit rough, so I wanted to maybe get something lighter into my system. So here we are. 20 books, no particular order, no particular system, just some books that I've read in 2024. Roadside Picnic by Strugatsky Brothers. This was actually my first book of the year that I was listening to when I was taking long hikes along the neighborhood. I kind of had this weird bias towards this Soviet sci-fi. I was kind of reluctant to do it, and I didn't really want to, get into it that much. But I decided to give it a try, and it appeared to be surprisingly good. So the story is pretty simple. Basically, there is this zone that was contaminated by aliens that they have not been seen after a while. And there are these guys who venture into this zone and they try to capture different pieces of alien technology and risk their lives for it. It's pretty fast. It's not a very long book. It has some very interesting characters. It has some interesting ideas. It is not really super into science. It's kind of like more of an adventure story. Very well done. And I guess the biggest takeaway for me is that after all these years, Strugatsky Brothers appear to be very good writers, and you can easily, and I will try to probably read something by them, in the nearest future. Overall, a very good book. I can recommend. Hyperion by Dan Simmons. This is probably one of the more difficult books that I've read this year. It is a very famous book, part of a series that was written by Dan Simmons. Most of the people, I think, know Dan Simmons thanks to the Terror, a novel that he has written. But this is actually one of his earlier works, and he started working on this book, telling these stories when he was still working as a teacher, and he told some of these stories to his students. It's a very dark, very kind of like pessimistic book. It's a sci-fi novel about kind of like humanity and its empire that has basically kind of like covered all the known universe. And there are a couple of factions, and we follow a group of kind of seemingly random people who go on a journey to a planet that is called Hyperion to meet a weird metallic monster and kind of like face their doom. It is super dark, super grimy, not something for the faint of heart. It has this disjointed structure that is inspired by the Canterbury Tales, and it's I can't say that I really enjoyed it, but it left so many questions unanswered because this is basically like a prologue. And I thought, okay, so I have kind of like tortured myself through the first part. I might as well figure out how it ends. And that's kind of like where Hyperion left me. The Fall of Hyperion by Dan Simmons. So this is the kind of like the second part of the book of the Hyperion series, which I actually really enjoyed. While the first book was a little bit disjointed and we got a little bit of a very gloomy and dark introduction to some of these characters, the second book basically picks up where the first one ended, and it goes straight into the action. There are new characters introduced, there is war going on, there is like sentient AI, that is like a godlike being and stuff like that. And there's just a lot more action. It's much more linear. All the questions are answered, and it's just like an amazing, thrilling adventure. and I really enjoyed it. I think in the afterward, I read that Dan Simmons was asked like, "What did you want to achieve? What do you want to do with this book?" And he said he basically wanted to give people this kind of like incredible feeling of a reading enjoyment. That's basically he wanted to give something that people are gonna get excited about. They're gonna get into the book and gonna live with these characters. And I think he did a very good job. It's basically your Three Musketeers, but it's a sci-fi, and it has a bunch of mysteries and a bunch of postmodernism, and it's just like a very fun, exciting read that actually ends kind of on a better note. It's not as gloomy, although it is still pretty dark. But I loved every minute of it, and I can definitely recommend it. Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. I am a big fan of a video game series called Thief. I really like those games, and I think they have some of the best writing in any of the kind of like fantasy games that we have. And I wanted to kind of read something similar. Like for me, fantasy is really tough because apart from maybe Martin and of course Tolkien, there's not many books that get me very excited. But a lot of people were praising Robin Hobb, and they were talking about Assassin's Apprentice in particular because it kind of like was similar to, at least in premise, to what Thief was. And I thought, okay, what the hell, I'm gonna try it. And it is basically a book that is almost 30 years now, 30 years old. And it's a book about this kid who kind of gets into the court. He's a bastard. He's a son, illegitimate son of one of the princes, a prince in waiting, sort of. And he basically gets kind of like tangled into this web of intrigue, and he meets different characters, and he goes to this kind of like a magical school, I would say, and he learns like the local version of magic, which is like telepathy in a way. And the whole action and everything happens inside that castle, and they go on a little trip towards the very end. So overall, I think it was an okay book. It is definitely in no way similar to what Thief was for me. It's not really super kind of like engaging. It is, I mean, once you read a couple of those fantasy books, you kind of know the structure and you know how it's gonna go and everything. It has some fun, interesting scenes. Like it's cool to see how this character develops. And I really like the characters. They're not really like two-dimensional. They all have different motivations and they kind of like act differently. So it's not like super young adult, I would say. But it's also like nothing to be compared with, the works I mentioned at the beginning. And it's kind of like an okay so-so story. But I did enjoy it. So I would not say go ahead and buy it immediately. But like if you have a chance, you can definitely read it. Empire of Silence by Christopher Uccino. I am not sure how I got to read this book. I think I heard some recommendations on YouTube, and people were raving about it, and they were saying this is like an amazing space opera. And I wanted to read some kind of like a space opera that was not, super dull, but it, at the same time was exciting and interesting. And people were kind of recommending this book, which is pretty long. I think it has over 7 or 6 books in that series alone, including different books of collections of short stories that are in that world. And I started reading it, listening to it, and it was about 700 pages. I did not enjoy it. It is incredibly long. It is super wordy. It is not really original at all. It tells you the story about this guy who's the son to a very wealthy family. He's part of this incredible like aristocracy in space. on a very big planet, and he has to follow his father's orders and go to become kind of like a space monk or a space torturer or something like that. Kind of become part of Inquisition, as far as I remember. And he ends up on some kind of like provincial planet, ends up being a gladiator, fights in some kind of pits, and he befriends a bunch of different misfits, and he also knows kind of like the language of the species that humanity is kind of fighting, and he meets one of those species, and it's kind of like it goes on and on and on, but it ends with nothing. So kind of like if the previous book that I talked about, the Assassin's Apprentice, kind of it has a real ending and there is a full stop at the end. This book, it's just kind of like it goes for 700 pages. It reminds you of any other science fiction book that you've read, from like Dune to, any other kind of like space adventure. And it kind of ends with nothing. He gets a spaceship, and I think he flies into space with his crew. And there's not really much character development. There's not really much going on in general. The reader that I was listening to sounds kind of like a little bit obnoxious. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but did not really enjoy it. Super long, super wordy, not very original. I do not recommend this book. A Fire Upon the Deep by Vernon Vinge. A Fire Upon the Deep by Vernon Vinge. So this is the book that I wanted to read for a while. A lot of people have it at the top of their sci-fi book lists, next to Blindside by Peter Watts, and this is one of my favorite sci-fi books ever. And I thought, okay, so I'll give it a try. I tried it a couple of times over the last couple of years, and I couldn't really get through it because some of the concepts seemed a little bit outlandish to me. And it is a very wild book, but basically it tells you a story about, there are two narratives. One narrative, there is a bunch of kids that crash on a planet that is inhabited by these dogs that communicate telepathically and work as a pack. So basically one pack is one person, and they manage to develop into like a medieval civilization. They build castles and catapults and scheme against each other and try to kill each other and so on. And there's like wars going on. And there you have these two kids that bring all the amazing new technology, including computers. And also on their spaceship, they have a weapon. And this weapon is the only weapon that can stop a very dark cosmic entity that is about to consume everything living. And in the second part of the narrative, we have a group of unlikely, comrades, including a human, a defrosted guy. Part of his conscious is part of another good computer space entity. And there are also a couple of talking trees that move around on trolleys, and they are space merchants, and they pilot the spaceship, and they try to find these kids. And you can kind of guess why I was skeptical in the beginning, because it does sound wild. It is very unusual, but interestingly enough, it does develop into a pretty interesting book with a bunch of action, very complex relationships between different parties, a very unusual structure of the universe where everything's happening. And it is a very human book. It kind of shows you all the different bits and pieces of what people are fighting with. And it is a lot of fun to read. I would not probably put it at the top of my list next to Blindside, but it is kind of close. It is an interesting book, and if you have a chance, And if you don't mind talking trees and, dogs that talk like humans, then give it a go. I think it's fun. A Morbid Taste for Bones by Alice Peters. So I guess Alice Peters is a pen name of an English writer, a woman who died in 1995. And she's kind of like this Agatha Christie, Miss Marple kind of writer who wrote a series of books about medieval monk, former crusader, who solves crimes. And in A Morbid Taste for Bones, basically this is like an introduction to this character, Brother Cadwell, who with a bunch of other monks tries to figure out who killed like a certain someone. I'm not gonna spoil it for you. As I was going into this book, and I think I bought it a while ago, I was kind of hoping to get something like The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, and I didn't really quite get it. This is just like a good English detective story with a bunch of words from medieval setting that I do not understand, and but it's fun and it's interesting. It's very light, and it kind of ends in a very funny manner that I thought, okay, so the only thing missing is probably like an apple pie and people hugging each other. So it's interesting read. I thought it was interesting enough to read a second book in the series, One Corpse Too Many by Alice Peters. So this is the second book in that series about Brother Cadwell's adventures. And this is where I kind of stopped with the series. It's gotten way too English. There were too many of these historical characters that their presence tells me very little. I don't really know them, and I was not really that engaged. It has a bunch of different mysteries and interesting characters and adventures and so on, but it's not really something that I want to invest too much time in it. So it's a full stop for me with this one, and I listened to it and finished it, and I moved to something else. The Ministry of Time by Kellyanne Bradley. I really liked it. I don't know how I got to reading it. So I think it was some kind of recommendation on Spotify or recommendation in one of the magazines that I've been reading. But basically, it's a kind of like a new book that has recently been published, and the premise is pretty simple, and I think that's what I liked about it. It is simple for like a time traveling novel. There's basically this lady who works in the government, and she's asked to babysit a time traveler, a guy who traveled from 1847 from that Arctic expedition that failed so miserably and became the base for the novel Terror that I think I mentioned at the beginning. It's written by Dan Simmons, who's the master writer, I guess, in this particular video. And she babysits Commander Gore. And it's just like a fun story. I think it uses this very popular, device where you have a time traveler who discovers like what the hell do you do with a washing machine, or how do you travel the streets, and Commander Gore, of course, talks in a very funny way, and of course these characters, they fall in love, and there's a bunch of other time travelers from different periods, from different wars and so on, and it's just like a fun, simple read, but at the same time it has a very interesting look into the world of this character who's an immigrant, and she has a lot on her plate. She has a lot of baggage, and she kind of like slowly gets into this weird situation, talks about her ideas and her perception of time and her perception of reality. And there's a little bit of kind of like a spy novel mixed into it, but the like 80% of it is basically they just the guy, charming guy from military ship, just gets together with this immigrant, and they have a wonderful time together in London, and they discover that they love each other, but it's not simple, of course. It usually is with these kind of books. Short book, a good read. I don't think it's the best of the best, and I don't really want to recommend it, but if you're looking for something lighter to read during Christmas or next year, you can give it a try. It's not that bad. To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. So I am not from the United States, as you could have figured out from the accent, and I never actually read this book. I didn't really have to read it in school, and I decided, what the hell, in 2024 I might as well read something. I absolutely loved it. It is amazing. It's kind of like this one of those books about kids, and all the books about kids are amazing if they're well written, and you go with this character on a journey, meet the family, meet the father, and I think I was listening to it and reading it from a perspective not of a kid but of a father now. I think it's kind of a book that it shows you how difficult it is sometimes to keep your marbles together, and how important it is to try to do so if you have children. Absolutely amazing. I highly recommend it, and I think not only you should read it, but you should buy a copy, and it should be somewhere in your study, and that one day you might share it with your kid. I really loved it. Shadow and Claw by Gene Wolfe. This was something, again, I wanted to read for a very long time. I never had enough courage to read it because it is incredibly complex. This is one of the books that is part of this Dying Earth subgenre, which is part science fiction, part fantasy. And the basic idea is that the Earth is dying, or the civilization is dying, and kind of like on the remains of that older civilization that was more technologically developed, you have a new society that is much less technologically developed and is very oppressive and authoritarian, and it's just kind of like a super dark, grim world. Shadow and Claw, it's basically two books. I think the first book is called Shadow of the Torture, and it talks about this main character, Hyperion, who kind of like learns the ropes of a very weird profession, which is a torturer. He's a torturer slash executioner, I guess, and he kind of like gives you a little bit of an introduction into this world, and introduces you to different characters, some of his, some of the masters, some of his teachers, some of his colleagues, and so on. And it is quite interesting. It's kind of reminding me of the Warhammer 40k universe in a way. Very dark, very grim, not a lot of good stuff happening, super violent. At the same time, there are a lot of these little mysteries in the archives and around the world, and it's fun to kind of like try to figure out what does the author really mean, like where are they going, and so on. And it's quite interesting. But as you get to the second part of the story, I felt like I was kind of going back to reading the Glass Beat game by Hermann Hesse, who's a German writer. And if you know what I'm talking about, it is kind of like this surreal trip of God knows what, God knows where. Very hard to figure out what's happening. Time itself kind of like changing, and you don't really understand, what happened. Was it like ages that happened, or was it just like a couple of hours? Very hard to read and get through it. I was kind of excited for him to kind of like leave that torturing school and go on a adventure, but nothing really happened after that. I mean, a lot happened, but it was kind of hard to deduce what was going on there and so on. He meets a bunch of different characters, participates in a bunch of different meetings and fights, and he wields this very fancy sword, and he even participates in a little play. It's just like too much, too weird, and this is kind of like where I stopped with the Book of the New Sun series, and I don't think I'm gonna come back, because for my taste, I like my fantasy a little bit more digestible. This is just a little bit too much over my head. The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon. So this is a book that I bought quite a while ago. I had it on my bedside table for maybe like a couple of years. I never really got to read it. And this year I did. Like it happened with so many books on this list. It is praised by critics overall, and it is interesting. But while it's interesting, I did not really enjoy it that much. It's a story about an autistic kid who writes a journal, and he's very good at math and very bad at reading people or understanding how society works. And it's just his story, like how he communicates with his parents, how he communicates with the world around him. And it's kind of like full of tragedy, full of misunderstandings, and so on and so forth, as you might expect. Very heartfelt book, but it's not really what you would call a masterpiece. It's okay. I guess you can read it, but I would not recommend spending money on it. You can get it in a library if you're so inclined, but in reality, you can just go ahead and skip it. It's not worth your time. City on Fire by Garth Risk Hallberg. Again, I had this book for a while. First time I came to United States in 2016, I bought it. It was like this humongous tome, very big, very heavy. And I think it was just lying in my apartment for the entire time. I never actually had the time to read it because it just looked so intimidating. It was so big. And the other interesting story about this book, I think the author got from the publisher something like $1 million, and everybody got so excited and so interested in saying, hey, this is going to be like the next big thing. And yeah, so it is a book about New York in the 70s, and it touches upon a bunch of different characters who live in different societies. There are some anarchists and arsonists. There are people who make fireworks. There are people who are kind of like in high society, super wealthy. There are artists and so on. And just kind of like from getting that into your system, you can kind of understand my excitement, because I thought it's going to be something like The Goldfinch or something like A Little Life, like this quintessential New York novel. So it does have some very cool bits, and in some chapters you almost feel like you are in the city. It is kind of like it transports you to that place, and you don't really get that a lot in literature. There are some very fun bits where we're talking about these wealthy people kind of trying to understand what to do, kind of like their lives and their little and big local tragedies and so on. Super interesting to read. Sometimes feels like it's another episode of Succession, which is an amazing TV show, and it's a very high praise to compare a piece of literature to that piece of kind of like television entertainment. But there are other bits, and unfortunately there is a majority of them that are kind of so-so, or they go nowhere. And more often than not, I found myself bored by this book. And it is a very long book. I think that if it's gotten kind of like a little bit trimmed to maybe like 600 pages, or even better, 400 pages, it would be a better book. But it is over, I think, 1,000 pages long. And it's just like unbearable at times. I think I started reading into it, then I started listening to it, and I listened to it till the very end. But apart from these little bits that I mentioned, there's just not really much happening in it. And while it's interesting to see what the characters are up to and how they develop and what's going on, it's just not enough to justify all the time that you have to put into this book. A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr. That's an interesting one. J.L. Carr he worked in a school. He was a headmaster in a school, and but literature was his passion, and he wrote a bunch of these little books, and he sold them himself, as far as I've read. And all his books, majority of them, are these little tiny little books that you could fit into an envelope and send over to the client, which I think is a great thing, because all his books are super short, and they are, you can go through them very quickly. And I think this is one of the advantages of, how the business model kind of like influenced the content. And A Month in the Country is kind of a great example of a short but very deep book. It's basically a story about a war veteran who goes into a country and into the countryside, I guess, and tries to restore a mural in a church. And he meets the locals, he falls in love, and then he breaks his heart yet again, and he packs his stuff and he goes on another adventure. It is a book about what's it like to be young in the summer. Absolutely wonderful. It is beautifully written. I've never read anything by J.L. Carr, and I think I just found him because people were, again, praising this on YouTube or somewhere, and it's just like an absolutely delightful little read, very easy, very romantic, and overall a lot of fun. I think this is one of the best books that I've read in 2024. Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb. The Royal Assassin is a sequel to Assassin's Apprentice. It's another book in that Farseer trilogy. I kind of read it because I already knew the characters, and it was just easy to get into. So kind of like it's a continuation of that story And I thought, okay, so I might as well kind of like continue to travel with that character fits and try to understand where is he going. And unfortunately, in this particular book, he was not really going anywhere. What I was expecting is to finally get on an adventure to, travel the world to see what's going on, what's happening, and so on. And what ended up happening is that the character is still in that castle. He's still going through all this kind of like court intrigue, and it's just not very engaging. I think the worst part of it, though, is that this character now has a romantic interest, and he kind of falls in love, and it's kind of like it goes for hours and hours, and it's just a drag to go through. I would not really like to go through this ever again. And frankly, overall, there's not much going on. It seems like, they decided to kind of milk this cow a little bit more and give him a couple more problems to deal with, but felt like it was just like standing in one place without moving. And that's why I did not really enjoy it. And I might never come back to this, to the continuation of this series, because if it's just as static as this one, I will not be able to bear it. Naked Sun by Isaac Asimov. I picked this book up in the library just at random. I don't think I've read anything by Isaac Asimov except for the first book in the Foundation series that I did not really enjoy. Most likely because it's very old. It's like it was written in the 50s, and I think it's just like it's not really very contemporary. This book was also written in the 50s, but I really did enjoy it. So it is a story about two detectives, one of them human, the other one is a robot, and they go on this distant planet and they try to solve an impossible murder. And this impossible murder basically happened on this planet where everybody lives alone in huge mansions, and there's a very small amount of people on the planet, and everything is like abundant, they are super rich, and but still one of them gets killed, and they're trying to figure out who did it. A very, very well written book. Isaac Asimov is definitely an amazing writer, because it's super concise, it is super clear, and it takes a lot of skill to write something like this. I think this book is just a tiny bit over 200 pages, maybe a little bit more, but you just go through it very quickly. It is a very easy read. It gives you a little bit of an intrigue, there's a little bit of a detective work, there is a little bit of this 4 laws of the robotics, manipulation, and at the end there are some messages for humanity. And I found it super comforting, very interesting, and overall a great example of the way that you can write science fiction, where it's not very wordy, it's very concise, and the editor sort of did his job well. War by Bob Woodward. At the beginning of this year, I promised myself that I'm gonna go and read more fiction and less nonfiction books. And this is one of the few nonfiction books that I actually read. The subject here is the war in Ukraine and the war in the Middle East, and how the American government kind of like dealt with both of those conflicts. A very fast read, very engaging. It reads kind of like a Tom Clancy novel in a way, and I would expect nothing less from a guy who actually uncovered the Watergate. Usually when I was reading this political nonfiction, I used to think that a lot of that was made up. I could not believe that people who are, in the office or somewhere making these big decisions, that they talk like this, that they communicate like this. But now, as I'm older and I went through a certain amount of different, life situations, I do think that unfortunately, these things are very true. This is exactly how, things are happening. This is exactly how people react. And it's interesting to have a look at that. The Creative Act, A Way of Being by Rick Rubin. As you might know, I work a lot with the creatives, and part of my job is to help creative people put themselves out there, promote themselves, get better jobs, get more, recognition, and so on. And as I was reading this book, I thought that this should be on the kind of like on the table of any creative person. You can just go ahead and open it at any page at any given time when you're having trouble, and this book is going to give you a little bit more comfort. Wonderful book, amazing. Rick Rubin is a music producer. He produced like a bunch of super popular bands, including like Rum DMC and many others. And I do feel like he really understands what it means to be a creative person. And he did work with many, many, many incredible creative people. And he developed this kind of framework that allows them to, avoid the blocks, find their voice, and try to do the best they can in order to kind of ship the final art that they're doing, piece of art that they're doing. I do like the kind of like printed version as well as an audiobook. Rick Rubin narrates the audiobook, and it's just like this very nice, chill, comforting nonfiction story that gives you little bits of advice on how to approach creative problems, how to solve them, but more importantly, how to stay true to yourself. I think this is a very cool story, a very interesting book, and I highly recommend it. Anti-Fragile: Things That Gain from Disorder by Nassim Taleb. I was listening to this book, and it almost felt to me like Nassim Taleb was a passenger and I was a taxi driver, and I was just taking him for these very long commutes with me, and he would just not stop talking. He would keep talking forever and ever. And while at the beginning it made sense, closer to our last commute, it just became a like incomprehensible jumble of words. He starts to talk about anti-fragility and the way that you can gain from, bad stuff happening in your life, but it ends up going into rants about the government, the medical system, the doctors, the nutrition, weightlifting, options trading, and many, many other things. I think Nassim Taleb is a good writer, I guess. I'm not sure about his like philosophy and all these other bits, but you can definitely read Black Swan. It's pretty cool. Anti-Fragile, I think it's just a little bit too many ideas in one package, so I don't really recommend it. Orbital by Samantha Harvey. So this book won the Booker Prize this year, and I thought, what the hell, let's read it. It is pretty short. I think it's just about 200 pages. As the title suggests, it is a story about the astronauts and cosmonauts who orbit the Earth on board of an international space station. And there's barely anything happening in this book. You're just getting a little bit of a glimpse of what these people are thinking about. What are they doing? How do they live? And it comes as no surprise that most of the things they're thinking about are not really aliens or, discovery of other planets or colonization of Mars, but it's about the people who are back at Earth. It's more of a poem, less of a novel. But if you're in that kind of a mood, I think you can give it a try. It's not really bad writing. I think it's pretty good, but it's just not my thing. Well, I guess you're just as tired as me. This is the end. It was 20 books I've read in 2024. Some good ones, some bad ones, some kind of like meh. If you want to hear more, see more videos like this, give me a thumbs up and like, and click the links below to support this initiative. Thank you, and see you next time. Well, that's the end of my book review of 2024. I'm still working on a couple of books, but I will probably not be able to finish them by the end of this year. Thank you so much for listening and watching this video to the very end. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a comment. If you didn't, also leave a comment. If you want to support my efforts, like, share, and subscribe. Thank you so much, and see you next year.